She was married to her brother to make a goddess out of a girl. Years later, on a winter day in Alexandria, a parcel arrived at the palace, small, heavy, and slick. Some say it was opened in silence. What lay inside drove a queen to something that looked, from the outside, like madness. Tonight, we're going to sit with one of antiquity's most unsettling stories, the life of Cleopatra II of Egypt. Not the famous Cleopatra who faced Rome. This was an earlier Cleopatra, an ancestor, alive almost 2 centuries before. Raised in the marble and cedar world of the Ptolemaic court, Cleopatra II was pledged in marriage to her brother while she was still a child. That was the way dynasties worked in Egypt under the heirs of Alexander the Great. Imitate the gods, marry like gods, rule like gods. On paper, it kept power pure. In practice, it can corrode the human heart. We will begin in Alexandria, a city of books and brine and polished bronze, where the sea beats against breakwaters built to hold the world at bay. We'll walk the corridors where Cleopatra II learned to act, to smile, and to read Roman demands in the faces of visitors. We'll follow her through a marriage made for statecraft, into a second marriage that twisted from alliance into brutality, and we'll watch her seize a throne on her own name when nearly all other options failed. And yes, we'll confront that gruesome parcel, the one that some ancient writers believed marked the moment her sorrow hardened into something that court gossip called insanity. But what does madness even mean in a palace that thrived on fear? We'll be careful, we'll say some sources say, because the ancient world was a hall of mirrors. In the end, this is a story about power, grief, and the ugly price of pretending that a family is a country. Settle in, take a breath. We'll keep our voices soft. The sea is close. You can almost hear it. To understand why a queen would be forced to marry her brother, why so many queens of Egypt did, we need to understand a kingdom that tried to make its rulers into living myths. Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE was a theater of learning and spectacle. The Pharos lighthouse burned like a star. The library, still alive then, swelled with papyrus. Markets smelled of resin and garlic and hot oil. And above it all, the palace complex, labyrinths of courtyards, porches, and shadowed rooms, where life was a long rehearsal for the idea of divinity. The Ptolemies were Greeks in Egypt, descendants of one Macedonian general who stood beside Alexander and, when the great conqueror died, took Egypt as his share. To rule a land whose gods, stories, and villages were older than Homer, they learned to speak 2 languages, Greek and God. In Egyptian myth, divine siblings, Isis and Osiris, were both brother and sister, husband and wife. They created a pattern for the cosmos. Order rises when the right pair rules together. Ptolemaic kings and queens leaned on that pattern. They ordered the priests to sing it. They stamped it into coins. They carved it into granite. A brother-sister marriage was more than a scandal. It was propaganda made flesh. In the abstract, this made perfect sense to a court where logic was political. It was an elegant argument. A single family, indivisible, sanctified by story. In the private hours, it was something else entirely. You could call it coercion with a golden spoon. Queens in that palace were not free to fall in love or to marry for anything less than stability. A princess like Cleopatra II grew up with it as a given. She learned to pour wine at dinners where poets recited and generals boasted. She absorbed the ritual language of coronations and the precise way to tilt her chin when standing on a dais beside a brother who would one day be her husband. Imagine a girl in a room that smells like cedar and rose water. Imagine voices through the thin walls, clerks, tutors, the shuffle of sandals, reciting genealogies as if they were spells. Her future is a script that's already been written, with only a few lines where she gets to improvise. The laws of the palace fit like a narrow dress. beautiful, constricting, and stitched so tight it leaves marks. When Cleopatra II was born, around 185 BCE, her father was Ptolemy V, and her mother was Cleopatra I, a Seleucid princess whose marriage to the king had briefly brought peace between Egypt and Syria. Cleopatra I was influential, one of the few Ptolemaic queens who ruled as a sole regent for a time. So our Cleopatra grew up with a model close at hand of a woman who could command, could negotiate, could make decrees in the language of temple stele. But the template for power carried its own pressure. It said, "You are the hinge that keeps the kingdom together. You're not allowed to break." Brother-sister marriages did one other thing. They simplified the map. Who could betray whom if everyone was both spouse and sibling? The Ptolemies found out the answer the hard way. Everyone. Keeping power pure condensed jealousy into the tightest possible space. Every quarrel was a dynastic crisis. Every heir was also a potential rival. The palace became a crucible, and Cleopatra II, as princess, knew early that she would be placed in that crucible and asked to hold her shape. She would not be allowed to choose the man she married. She would be told that the man was her brother and that it was divine. The sea keeps turning. We step toward the year when she becomes a queen. Cleopatra II married Ptolemy VI Philometor, her brother, when they were young. If she trembled under the wreath that day, the record does not tell us. It was an event stage-managed like a play. Priests in white linen, gold flares in the sunlight, the murmuring crowd beyond the palace walls praising a pair made to resemble gods. In Greek, there were siblings. In Egyptian, they were the latest Osiris and Isis, where roles were cosmic and love was ceremony. It would have been easier for the audience than it was for the actors. Ptolemy VI, by the accounts that survive, was clever and perhaps gentle by the harsh standards of their world. His epithet, Philometor, means mother-loving, and it likely came from the politics of regency. His mother ruled in his name when he was a child, but it tells you how kings wanted to be seen. Filial, soft at the edges. Behind him moved counselors, soldiers, and scribes. Beyond them, an expanding shadow, because the Ptolemaic kingdom, the wealthiest in the Mediterranean, had enemies who knew its weaknesses. One of those enemies was also family. Ptolemy VIII, the younger brother, nicknamed Physcon by later writers, a word that can suggest a great belly or thick-set body, a jab that hints at how he was remembered. In royal portraits, Ptolemy VIII looks like a man carved into blunt angles. You don't need to admire the bust to feel the menace it carried. 3 siblings, 2 thrones. The equation rarely stays balanced. At first, Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VI met their crisis together. In 170 BCE, while still young, they accepted their younger brother as co-ruler, partly to appease factions at court, partly to concentrate against the threat that mattered most, Syria. Over and over in that century, Egypt and the Seleucid Empire clawed each other along the coastlines and inland valleys of the Levant. The land might look dry to a traveler, but to kings it was wet with the irrigation channels of power. Whoever controlled the corridor between the Nile and the Euphrates could tilt the balance of the known world. Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king, marched into Egypt in 169 BCE. The ground of the delta drank up the feet of his infantry. The Nile glittered with foreign oars. The royal family panicked, then posed. Cleopatra II stood beside her husband in public appearances and reassured their people with a well-practiced stillness. The Ptolemaic court understood optics. When you cannot be strong, you can at least look immortal. And when Antiochus returned for a second invasion in 168, he found that even immortals have patrons. A Roman envoy confronted him at a village called Eleusis, drew a circle in the sand around him with a stick, and told him to decide, before he stepped out of the circle, whether he would leave Egypt. Antiochus left, Rome arrogated the right to draw circles around Eastern kings that year. The Ptolemies learned what it meant to survive by grace, not by force. In the palace, Cleopatra II watched the men from the west and felt, perhaps, a new chill. Their togas flapped in the sea breeze like flags. They were not angry, only firm, and their firmness would eventually reach every shoreline. But in the moment, the day had been saved, and the queen remained at the side of her brother husband. They had children. One of their daughters, Cleopatra III, would marry into the Seleucid court, becoming a queen of Syria and learning lessons about power that ran parallel to her mother's. Another daughter, Cleopatra III, would one day be the fulcrum on which Cleopatra II's life would tilt from rage into heartbreak. For now, there was a brief calm. The co-regency with Ptolemy VIII faltered and then broke. In 164 BCE, Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II ruled without the younger brother. Ptolemy VIII was nudged into Seneca, the western territory of the kingdom, like a wolf pushed out of the den but left alive. You can hear the future snapping its teeth. In 145 BCE, everything changed. In a contest over Syria, Ptolemy VI won a battle, then lost his life. Wounds, accident, exhaustion. The sources disagree. Cleopatra II, then queen consort and mother of heirs, faced a familiar but terrifying crossroads. Without a male partner on the throne, the ideology of her state would not hold. The solution was both predictable and devastating. Her younger brother returned from Cyrene. He consoled Alexandria with a silver-tongued Euergetes, the benefactor, and he married his sister, the queen. Here we must slow down. We must respect the way a person can endure what others decide is inevitable, while feeling that inevitability like a hand around the throat. Cleopatra II, who had already performed the part of sister wife once, performed it again. She could have been 39 or 40. She stepped into the ritual, wore the diadem, stood beside a man whose eyes, the busts, the texts, tell us were watchful and cold. This marriage, more than a first, would test the human being inside the goddess. You can almost hear the drums. The room is hot with breath. Somewhere beyond the walls, waves bruise themselves against the stones of the harbor. A queen lifts her chin, and the city pretends that none of this is an injury. Ptolemy VIII's rule has a texture to it that you can feel with your fingertips even across the centuries. It is rough, petty, vindictive. He could be generous as an actor can be generous, on cue for applause. He staged pageants, gave dinners, scattered coins to the crowd. But he was a man with a ledger in his head. Injuries were tallied. Slights, real or invented, were not forgiven. It was precisely the wrong temperament for a city stuffed with scholars and courtiers who offered opinions like honeyed figs. Within a few years of marriage number 2, Cleopatra II's second marriage to a brother, this time to Ptolemy VIII, another act of theater was staged that stripped the stage of its pretense. The king married again, not after divorce, not after widowhood. He married his niece, Cleopatra III, the daughter of Cleopatra II by her first marriage. The mother remained one queen in name. The daughter became another. To some priests, this could be folded back into myth. To the people in the palace, it was salt rubbed in a wound. To Cleopatra II, it was a violation so personal that the political word for it, alliance, turned to ash on the tongue. A triple marriage made the ideology of divinity look grotesque. Family bonds had always been complicated in Alexandria. Now they were weaponized. Cleopatra III, young, ambitious, and, if we read between the lines of later propaganda, sharp enough to survive, stood at the king's side and bore him children. Cleopatra II, whose child had been taken into her bed by a man who called himself benefactor, started counting injuries of her own. Ptolemy VIII didn't stop there. A scholar named Aristarchus, the greatest of Alexandrian librarians, fled to Cyprus around this time. Others followed. Exiles began to the map. The message was simple. The court would be quiet or it would be silenced. Some sources say that during Ptolemy VIII's purges, Greek intellectuals joked in whispers about a new laboratory, the island called Escape. A queen could not join them. She was anchored to the palace by lineage and law. But she watched, and she learned what kind of king she was living beside. We call him Physcon because later authors called him that. We should remember that nicknames are tools. They strip dignity from enemies. They turn complex men into cruel cartoons. But sometimes the cartoons fit too well. The younger brother had envied the older. The little brother was now the big one, and he thumped his chest like a child. We get glimpses of Cleopatra II during these years in the form of official inscriptions and the politics of coinage. This is how queens speak to us across time. Coins begin to carry her profile. The soft folds of a face are simplified into a symbol. Her name appears alone, then beside the king's, then alone again, as if her identity were being tested in public. When a king takes your daughter to his bed and calls it holy, the stage is set for rebellion, even if you never meant to rebel. Ptolemy VIII had a son with Cleopatra II, a boy who came to be called Ptolemy Memphis because he was recognized in Memphis, the old Egyptian capital. He had soft cheeks and a future made of marble. He was not to be king for long. Cleopatra II endured. She received dignitaries, stood at festivals, watched the moon wheel over the palace courts. A mother sees a family story going crooked and begins to collect every straight twig she can find. She looks for levers. She waits for moments. Cleopatra II waited. Even stories that look inevitable have hinge points. Ours was next. The rebellion began like a rumor and turned into a city. In 132 BCE, with the triple marriage now a grotesque normal, Cleopatra II gathered her supporters, counted allies in temples and in the guard, and declared herself sole ruler in Alexandria. She minted coins in her own name. She held the ceremonies, gave the orders, and stood alone on a dais where for decades the ideology had insisted on two. Think about the audacity of that moment. A queen who had been made into a goddess by being paired with men, now commanding a scene without them. This was an act of defiance and of survival. It told the city, your queen, the one whose body has been policy, is a person who can rule. Some sources say Alexandria took to her with a sigh of relief. The city had always loved spectacle, but it also loved cleverness and poise. Cleopatra, too, embodied both. Ptolemy VIII fled with Cleopatra III to Cyprus, measuring the loss and plotting a comeback. He had his enemies, but he had money, and money draws ships. Cleopatra II needed a king in her column to lock the story into a form the temples could bless. She had a son. The boy had a father, the man she had chased out, but many kings have been crowned with fathers far from the room. Cleopatra II proclaimed her son co-ruler, named him king, and stood behind him during the rites. The headband pressed into her hair. The child's small hand sweated in hers. The rituals said the world was orderly again. The truth was that order had become make-believe. From Cyprus, Ptolemy VIII plotted a return. He had Cleopatra III, who was formidable in her own right and who knew exactly how to turn the machinery of the state to her own advantage. The couple wrote letters to allies. They bribed, they recruited. The old layers of the empire, the satrapies and client kingdoms, came to life like a snake shaking off sleep. The Nile saw sails gathering like storm clouds. Then came the parcel. This is the part where we take care because even as we tell it, we must say, some sources say, we must inhale gently and speak in a voice that understands the gravity of gossip preserved as history. Ancient writers, Diodorus, Justin, tell a story that Ptolemy VIII took his revenge not with a battle, but with a message. He ordered the boy, Ptolemy Memphis, his son, and Cleopatra II, to be killed. The way they tell it, He had the child dismembered, and he packed the parts into a chest, and he sent it to Alexandria, and it arrived on Cleopatra II's birthday. She opened it. The room tilted. From that moment, the chroniclers say, the queen went mad with grief. It is hard to hold the words that might have left her mouth. It is easy to imagine the silence that might have swallowed the room. Some horrors are too large to scream about. They mute the human body. You stand by a window that looks over the city, and you feel as though you're falling onto the streets below, and yet your feet are still on the floor. Is that madness? Or is it the exact right reaction to a palace that has made cruelty into a sacrament? In the weeks that followed, Alexandria learned what it meant when maternal grief acquired a throne. Cleopatra too sharpened her politics, which is to say, she sharpened her knives. She held the city. She made deals with factions that used to disdain her. She became a portrait of resolve, even if, inside, something had cracked. It is possible to be broken and still be effective. It is also possible to call a woman mad when what you fear is her moral clarity. Ptolemy VIII did not walk away. He crossed from Cyprus. He wove alliances. He returned like a stain that will not scrub out. When the ships began to the horizon and the soldiers in the alleys began to mutter, Cleopatra II made a choice that either was madness or was strategy, and both can be true. She reached for help in the north. She called on Damascus. She called on a Seleucid prince, Demetrius II, to invade Egypt on her behalf. Imagine the calculation. Trust a neighbor who has attacked you to save you from a brother who used to be your husband. It is the kind of compromise that breaks the heart twice. Demetrius's army tasted the delta's damp air and then retreated. Some say the bribes were heavy. Some say the logistics were not. Perhaps he simply misread the map of fear. Cleopatra too watched another solution dissolve in the heat, and then the tide turned in the only direction left. It turned away. When Ptolemy VIII forced his way back into the city, Cleopatra II left. To leave a city you have ruled is to shed a skin. She crossed into Syria. She accepted the hospitality of the empire that had once tried to swallow Egypt. It was humbling, and it was practical. The chronicle scribes imagine her as a tragic figure at this point, a mother in exile, a woman undone by grief. The coins in Alexandria suggest another picture. Even as she fled, her profile did not disappear. Word of her lived in the mints and the gossip of grandparents to children. Our queen gone but not gone. In exile, Cleopatra II had time to think. If that sentence sounds gentle, imagine the sleepless nights. The skin of a city dries on you. The salt never leaves. You replay every scene as if you could choose differently, and of course you could not, because to survive in a palace like that is to be reprogrammed by necessity. She had done what she had to do. She had lost what she could not bear to lose. Now what? Politics called to her again. It is always something gnawing just under the breastbone in people who are good at it. She brokered connections, wrote letters, made offers to people who needed a queen to anchor their ambitions. The Seleucid court, ever factional, ever hungry, considered its options. Demetrius too had retreated, but there were others. Cleopatra too could be a symbol for somebody else's rise, even as she tried to stitch her own story back together. Back in Egypt, Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra III tightened their grip. An amnesty was declared a few years later, an attempt to soothe the wounds left by the civil war, to bring back those who had fled, to make the kingdom feel like an operating kingdom again. The policy is recorded on stone, the so-called amnesty decree, and it reads like what it was, the winners offering terms written in the language of their own victories. But if you read it with Cleopatra II in mind, it also reads like an admission that her rebellion had been real enough to matter. The kingdom had to be stitched because the queen had torn it. This is the part of the story that almost no one remembers because it is not shocking and it is not cinematic. It is the part where time does its work and bends people toward a compromise they might have laughed at once. Around 124 BCE, Cleopatra II returned to Alexandria. Reconciliation was fashioned, not a friendship, not even a peace, just a truce sharp as glass. Cleopatra II, Ptolemy VIII, and Cleopatra III stood together on dais once more. It must have felt like swallowing sand. From the outside, this looked like a restoration of normalcy. Gods on a temple wall can be painted holding hands, even if the humans behind them cannot stand a touch. At festivals, the city cheered. In the library, scholars tiptoed. In the alleys, storytellers whispered the tale of the parcel. The queen screamed that may or may not have been real. The king who could smile while drawing up a death warrant. People survive by telling themselves that everything will be all right. People also survive by reminding each other that sometimes it won't. For a brief, while a handful of years, the court managed to act like a court again. Cleopatra II was older now, and authority sat on her shoulders as something she would not need to prove again. She had already paid for it. She signed documents that flowed through the temples like water through irrigation channels. Her figure appears in reliefs carved at Dendera and other sacred places, her outline stiff with ritual, her jaw set. One priest would chisel the words Basileia Cleopatra, Queen Cleopatra, into a block that would outlast empires. That's the kind of stubbornness stone understands. When Ptolemy VIII died in 116 BC, fat, middle-aged, a man who had survived most of his enemies by becoming a moving target, it was Cleopatra III who inherited the power to choose which of her sons would be king. That choice lit another civil war, but it was no longer Cleopatra II's to fight. She seems to fade from the record around that time, her long life slipping quietly under the surface like a ship that never sank, just sailed out into a fog. Which leaves us with a question. Did she go mad? Or did grief play the ancient game of dress-up and power the even older game of survival? Madness is such a useful word for old historians. It absolves kings and queens of responsibility, and it also lets them look interesting. It turns a woman's fury into a symptom, a woman's strategy into a disease. In the case of Cleopatra II, the label does more than simplify. It lets us avoid saying ugly things about what the Ptolemaic system did to its people. Let's name some of those ugly things clearly, because that's our job. First, the marriage. Cleopatra II did not choose to marry her brother. It was policy, and policy enforced by the weight of expectation, a nation's ideology, and the reality that if she refused, there might be a war for which she would be blamed. In that sense, forced is not melodramatic. It is precise. The hand on the back that pushes you down the aisle can be a gentle one. It is still a shove. Second, the double betrayal. When Ptolemy VIII married Cleopatra III, he did it in a palace that had rooms only for family. He did it in a system that could not be reformed from within because its entire skeleton had been reshaped to make power a family affair. If Cleopatra II resented her daughter, some sources hint at it. If she resented the circumstances more, it is because she was smart. Third, the murder of her son, the chest, the cuts, the birthday. Even if we grant that writers may have added flair to the story, a child died as a message to a mother. That is not a myth. It is an inhumanly human act. What could the proper response be? Politeness? Stoicism? Tears in private and a calm face in public? Cleopatra II tried that in various forms for years. When she finally rebelled, how could anyone be surprised? And fourth, the city itself. Alexandria taught people to perform their lives. No one was allowed to be entirely themselves in public. Everyone had a role to play, and the director was the state. If Cleopatra II sometimes looked, how shall we say, unsteady, It may have been because the role demanded that she act like a calm goddess while the human underneath was breaking apart. You try it. You try smiling at a festival, knowing that in a room somewhere a parcel was opened and there was a mother who would never recover. Some modern historians are suspicious of the madness claim. They recognize its utility as a smear. Ptolemaic propaganda was noisy. In that world, a woman who rules alone is a problem that must be solved either by marriage or by character assassination. If smearing her as hysterical didn't stop her, at least it would stop her memory. Remarkably, it did not. Her name remains on stone. Her coins rest in museums, their surfaces soft with age, her face still the face of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. But let's not tidy it up too much. Let us admit a final point. Grief can make people irrational. It can make you act with the suddenness of lightning. It can cut patience short and blunt the fine control you once had over your own body. Cleopatra II may well have had days from which she never fully returned. We should honor that possibility by refusing to turn it into gossip. What we can say is that she kept going. She printed her name into history after she had been amputated from herself. And if being forced to marry her brother was wound number one, the parcel was wound number last. And what did all this do to Egypt? It etched a warning into the palace walls. The story of purity used as politics will always find a boiling point where the human beings explode. It taught the court something else, too. Never underestimate a queen whose life has been used as a public tool. She will surprise you. And if you hurt her children, she will not forgive you even if she smiles at the festival. We began in a palace, with a whisper and a heavy chest. We watched a queen do what she had to do. Twice, because the temple stories demanded it. We watched her lose, then rebel, then flee, then return, then fade. We watched her called mad, and we tried to understand the temperature of that word. Cleopatra II's life is a reminder that sometimes the scandal is not the behavior of a woman under strain. It is the machinery that put her there, polished to a shine, and called religion or tradition or law. And if one parcel could undo a queen, it could also reveal the truth about a king. Titles like euergetes, benefactor, can be lacquer over wood that has already started to rot. If Cleopatra II went mad, as some sources say, perhaps it was only because she was sane enough to recognize the rot. If you felt the chill of that palace, if you want more stories told in a low voice with the scene nearby and the candles guttering, stay with me. There are more rooms to walk through. There are more queens whose names we whisper because the echo is kinder than the shout.